Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Madeleine Pownall and I am a lecturer in psychology at the School of Psychology in the University of Leeds in the UK. And I am a mixed method social psychologist and educator. So what I'm particularly interested in is thinking about what open science means for different types of research methodologies. And I'm here talking to you with the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training, FORT, the Jacobs Foundation and CERES. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about what open science or open scholarship means for qualitative research. So I'm going to start with a bit of an overview about what I mean by qualitative research, because I don't think it's as simple as having kind of one definition. Then I'm going to be giving three examples, three kind of case studies for how open science can be embedded in qualitative research and all the different kind of considerations that you might want to think about when translating open science to qualitative methods. Before ending with some wider thoughts and considerations about the appropriateness or applicability of open science with this kind of approach. So just to provide a bit of context, so within the FORT clusters, the Framework for Open and Reproducible Research Training clusters, there's all kinds of different dimensions to open science. And the ones that I am going to be focusing this presentation on is qualitative research, which comes under the conceptual and statistical knowledge cluster. I'm going to be talking a little bit about pre-registration. I'll explain what pre-registration is and how it might be a useful tool for qualitative methods. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about fair data and open materials as well, and talking a bit about how that could be useful for qualitative researchers. So I think it's important just to provide a bit of context to kind of explain that qualitative research is not one singular term. So some people talk about qualitative research as if it kind of encompasses one set of methodologies and one set of approaches, whereas actually I really like how Victoria Clark, who's a kind of leading qualitative researcher, particularly in psychology, refers to qualitative research as a messy swamp filled with all different kinds of ideas, methods, way of approaching data, way of thinking about participants, and way of thinking about data analysis. So I think it's important to note that while I'm going to be kind of talking about qualitative research, there really is no one qualitative approach. So the qualitative research that you do will encompass the methodology, so the different kinds of methods, whether you interview people, whether you do focus groups, whether you analyse pre-existing data. And it also encompasses two important things that I'll just touch on a little bit, which are epistemology and ontology. And basically what this refers to is how you see the world. So how you see knowledge, how you see kind of knowledge production. And qualitative research kind of comes from a broad spectrum of different epistemologies. So you can have everything from what's called small Q research, which tends to come from quite a positivist, and that means quite descriptive, kind of low level of interpretation type of qualitative analysis. So this might include things like a content analysis, when you kind of quantify the existence of patterns in your textual data, all the way to the other side of the spectrum, which is kind of big Q, sort of heavy lifting, theoretical, conceptual, philosophical approaches to qualitative research. So this includes things a bit more like kind of thematic analyses or interpretive phenomenological analyses as well. So I think it's kind of important just to provide the context there that I'm talking about qualitative research, and yet it really varies in terms of epistemology and methodology as well. So we know quite a bit about what open science looks like for quantitative research, but I think it's important to think about what does robust qualitative research look like? So what are we kind of aiming towards when we want to embed open science in qualitative approaches? So here are just a couple of ideas around kind of evidence-based parameters for what robust qualitative research looks like. So the first one I think is really important. So robust or good, rigorous qualitative research is attentive to research positionality and reflexivity. So basically what that means is that qualitative research really acknowledges that who you are as a research affects the lens through which you view your research. So in other words, if I was to do a study, then the way that I kind of view the data, the way I interpret the data, the way I'm drawn to the research question will be very different compared to somebody else. So who I am as a person, I bring that to the research. So there's been all kinds of discussion recently in the qualitative research community about how we can really attend to researcher positionality. So this has led to the advent and things such as positionality statements. So when you write your manuscript, you include a section that really spells out, this is who I am, this is my bias, this is how I view the data. And I think that this is something that quantitative research is also sort of slowly starting to adopt during the open science or open scholarship conversation. Secondly, robust qualitative research is transparent and it's theoretically robust. So it's based on theory and it's based on evidence. And that kind of goes back to that note about epistemology as well. Related to that, qualitative research that's good and robust is well justified, and it has well justified and well considered methods and data collection means. So the way that you choose where you get your data from and how you collect your data and how you analyse your data is theoretically kind of justified, and it's well considered, it's thoughtful. Also, qualitative research that's robust and good and rigorous is non-intrusive. And where it's appropriate, it's not always appropriate, it's participatory. So what I mean by this is instead of as researchers kind of going into a community, collecting some data in quite an intrusive way, and then leaving again, never to be seen again, then really robust and really good qualitative research is more kind of participatory and community-based and is done in partnership rather than done as a kind of researcher being intrusive. And I also, and this is a really important point, that robust qualitative research is not necessarily concerned with reproducibility. So going back to that point about how we know in qualitative research that who you are as a researcher affects how you view the data, that what that means is that reproducibility, so in other words, somebody being able to reproduce or verify somebody else's results, isn't necessarily a kind of hallmark of robust qualitative research because of those elements of positionality and reflexivity that feed into how the research is analysed. So I think given all these things, it's important to think about what open qualitative research could or should look like. So for some context, there's been quite a bit of concern over, particularly in the last couple of years, around just kind of blindly translating standards that are appropriate for quantitative research to qualitative questions. So a good example of this is there's been a lot of discussion around whether replication is possible for qualitative research. So in other words, if I as a researcher run an interview study and report my findings, then does it matter if somebody else runs exactly the same study, asks the same questions and finds different results? Like, is that kind of problematic in terms of the robustness of the research? And this is kind of presenting some epistemological tension. So going back to that idea, basically, of whether you view knowledge as being something that participants bring or something that's kind of an underlying truth that you can extract. And this has led to, as I've touched on before, incompatibility with some of the kind of core goals of open science. And now I use this quote in all of my talks. I think it's a beautiful quote, and I just want you to kind of think about this as I talk for the rest of this presentation. That Albornoz says, openness is an instrument to mobilise power. It can be used to disrupt power structures and to strengthen them. We must interrogate whose interest is openness serving and whose is it neglecting. And I kind of just want you to kind of keep this in mind as I'm talking about the translation of open science practices to qualitative research. So I'm now going to be giving 3 fairly brief case studies for how open science practices can be done quite productively with qualitative research. So the first one that I want to talk to you about is open data. So open data is essentially just refers to the open, transparent sharing of study data. And typically, the kind of open data conversation has really started with the view to enhance reproducibility. So open data, as it kind of started, has been thought of as being a really useful tool to reassess researchers' claims, so be able to kind of verify their claims with their data being open. but it's also a really useful opportunity for secondary analysis. So, for example, I have a screenshot here of a qualitative study that was done with participants who were recollecting dental visits. And this was published in the Journal of Open Psychology Data, so they're openly sharing a qualitative data set to suggest that this might actually be useful for other researchers doing secondary analysis, so looking at the data in a slightly different way. So for qualitative or for textual data, then open data can be useful, not necessarily in terms of that verifying reproducibility, but instead it can be really useful for provide opportunity for secondary analysis, because what this does is this reduces duplication and it reduces waste. So in practice, then sharing anonymized data sets can be done on platforms such as the Open Science Framework. There's the Journal of Open Psychology Data. So this just publishes data sets with a little kind of short text around describing what the data looks like, and all kinds of other platforms as well. Now, there are, of course, some important considerations for openly sharing qualitative data. So there's issues such as ethics. So have you explicitly told participants how you were going to be sharing their data and in what form? And it's important that this is kind of baked into the early stages of the research process. There's also much wider issues for qualitative data of anonymity. So for some qualitative data sets, they just can't really be made anonymous or can't be made unidentifiable, which presents challenges for openly sharing that data. But working with, for example, library teams and working with open data support administrators can be really useful to kind of figure out the nuances of what can be shared and what can't be shared. The second case study, which I think is really useful for qualitative research, is pre-registration. So pre-registration refers to a openly available, time-stamped plan. So essentially, before you've collected any data, or if you're doing secondary analysis before you've accessed that data, then in a pre-registration, you will lay out your data analysis plan. So this is what I'm thinking of doing, these are my questions, and this is what I'm going to do with the data. Now, this is again one of those that's kind of started out from the quantitative domain, but is actually, I think, really useful for qualitative approaches. So historically, pre-registration has been thought of as being really useful for reducing p-hacking. So in quantitative data, this basically means hacking away at your data, trying to find something that's significant so you can publish it. It's also useful for quantitative data in reducing hypothesizing after your results are known. So essentially finding something and then trying to kind of post hoc state that that's what you were always interested in. And it's also, for quantitative data, useful to avoid kind of phishing, so trying to find something that's publishable. So there's been quite a lot of debate and discussion around the usefulness of pre-registration for qualitative approaches. And I think that the most useful part of pre-registering qualitative research is that it really prompts you to be really transparent in your decision-making process. So aside from a kind of data analysis plan and a pre-registration, what it can prompt you to do as a researcher is to really think, going back to that issue of positionality and reflexivity, what am I bringing to this research? So in some of the pre-registration templates on the Open Science Framework, there's a space for kind of positionality. So what am I bringing to this research? What are my research questions? And what are some of my kind of early ideas for how I'm going to analyse this data? Now, in terms of considerations, I think it's really important that when we're talking about pre-registration of qualitative data, that we really factor in flexibility. Because often with qualitative data, you don't really know how you're going to analyse it until you receive the data, until you get it. So this might be due to issues such as you don't know how rich the data set's going to be, you don't know how much participants are going to tell you, you don't know whether it's going to be kind of more appropriate for that kind of small Q content analysis, or whether there's actually some really rich inductive stuff to get into from a more theoretical perspective. So pre-registration can be useful to just kind of transparently report that decision making. And what it can do in this sense is really show the process of the study in a really transparent way, above and beyond what you typically get in a kind of published manuscript. So I think it's important to think about pre-registration as being a kind of way of enhancing transparency of the qualitative process, rather than necessarily in the same way with the quantitative research as being a way of locking in your data analysis plan. And there's some good papers here that talk about the nuances of this in a little bit more detail. Finally, my third case study, which I think is a really, really useful tool and practice for qualitative research, is around reporting guidelines. So with the kind of advent of open science and open scholarship, there's been all kinds of emphasis on standardized guidelines for how we report, disseminate, and interpret research. And all of this aims to basically improve the rigor and the robustness and the standardization of research. And now there's all kinds of standardized guidelines that are particularly useful for qualitative research. So I've included a link here to the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research, which just gives researchers a checklist for when you're doing research with interviews and focus groups, just to make sure that what you're doing is thoughtful and well thought out and well considered. So if you remember at the start of my presentation, I talked about how really good qualitative research is really intentional and really thoughtful and well considered with how you think about your data collection means and your data analysis approach as well. So these kind of standardized reporting guidelines, which have been published kind of under the banner of open science and aiming to improve research robustness, can be a really useful way, particularly for qualitative research, of attending to this. Now, there are some considerations. So like with many things in qualitative research, this has prompted a big discussion around the kind of appropriateness of some of these guidelines. So there's some good published papers here that I've linked to that talk about the difficulty in establishing a consensus, particularly because we know that qualitative research is this messy swamp. And other researchers as well talk about the need for these kind of reporting guidelines to be theoretically relevant to the kind of research that you're doing. So I think as a researcher, it's useful to think of these guidelines as guidelines rather than kind of mandates. And I think for a researcher in a qualitative point of view, getting started in open science, they're a really useful way of just checking what you're doing is thoughtful and robust. So they were my kind of 3 case studies. I'd like to end with this quote because I think it really summarises some of the much messier, complicated issues with qualitative research and open science. And this is a paper by Elizabeth Bennett that was published in a special issue of the journal Psychology of Women Quarterly that was all about what open science means for feminist or kind of radically feminist perspectives on science or on scholarship. And she asks, what does open science mean for research methodologies that have historically been a home for transgressive and radical question asking? And there's a couple of papers that I've linked to here that really kind of articulate in much more depth some of the thornier issues around what open science means for how we think about consent, how we think about knowledge production, how we think about ethics, and how we think about where we're getting our data from. So I wanted to leave that with you because I think that there's kind of some much richer conversations being had in the literature at the moment around the relevance of qualitative research and open science and what they can inform one another. But that's everything from me. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been helpful.